This chapter explains specific software development activities that occur when using open source, or indeed any other software. It is important to understand these general software development activities in order to plan, prepare, and deploy processes to effectively manage open source licensing, because the way you use the open source may impact which obligations you have to meet. This chapter does not require a software engineering background. Whilst I discuss some concepts from software engineering, I will do so in a non-technical way. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to understand different possible ways to integrate open source within a product and what that means for the distribution of the product. When designing software, developers decide whether to include open source components and which ones to include. Sometimes they need to decide what parts of the software will be proprietary and what parts will be open source. They also need to make decisions about specific actions undertaken in the development process. These decisions can impact what licenses can be used or which open source components you would consider for different parts of the software, or different product offerings, and so on. Incorporating open source with proprietary software can be done in several ways. Depending on the license of the open source, the means of incorporation can have an impact on the obligations required to be satisfied in order to comply with the license. The common scenarios are 1. Incorporation of software, 2. Linking of software, and 3. Modification of software. Code incorporation is a situation where portions of one software component are copied into another software component or product. In the illustration, we are visualizing a situation where a developer copies portion of an open source component, that's shown in green, into a software product that's depicted in blue. There are various terms that describe different forms or activities around incorporation. It's useful to be aware of these terms to ensure you understand any briefings and decisions about this activity. For example, integration, putting software into another piece of software. Alternative terms here that are used are inserting or embedding. Merging, which is combining two different pieces of software. Pasting, in other words, copying and pasting parts of one piece of software into another. And adapting, adjusting a part or the whole of one piece of software with or without external code. For example, if the code incorporated is under a GPL license, under that license, the entire resulting code, the green and the blue in our illustration, would have to be made available under the GPL license as a derivative work when the code is distributed. Linking is a situation where two different software components are connected in a specific way, called linking. In the illustration, we are visualizing a situation where a developer links one open source component, that's depicted in green, and one proprietary component, that's depicted in blue. There are various terms that describe different forms or activities around linking, and it's useful to be aware of these terms to ensure you understand briefings and decisions about this. Linking is particularly important to consider in the context of copyleft open source licenses. There are two ways of linking: static linking, which is incorporation at build time, and dynamic linking, where the link is determined at runtime. Other terms or ways of talking about either static or dynamic linking are pairing, combining, utilizing, packaging, and creating interdependencies. Modification is a situation where a software component is changed, improved, or otherwise edited. In our illustration, we're visualizing a situation where a developer adds a software component, depicted in blue, to an existing codebase, depicted in green. And the outcome is a new software component influenced by both the original software component and the developer's contribution. And there are various terms that describe slightly different forms of modification, and it's useful to be aware of these terms to ensure that you understand briefings and decisions about this. Terms like improving, bug fixing, removing technical debt, deletion, or optimization. Many licenses require that modifications are documented, which is good software engineering practice via code comments anyway, and some licenses have additional obligations such as the Mozilla Public License, or MPL, where the modified source code needs to be made available. All of the activities we have discussed so far are undertaken by developers. However, it's also important to understand that software development is a process facilitated by tools. These are referred to as development tools or development environments and provide a level of automation to ensure work efficiency. The consequences of using development tools can include more than the manipulation of software components. For example, in some cases, a development tool may inject code into a software component to provide an outcome. It's important to be aware of this and ask questions around this to ensure developers and managers know what the final software component contains. Two common examples are: 1. A tool may silently pull in dependencies with their own license requirements that you need to know about. Usually the tool will have an option for outputting any such dependencies used. And 2. There may be silent injection of code from the tool itself under an open source license. This is often under the same license or a more permissive license than the tool itself, but still needs to be tracked regardless. Finally, an important consideration is for an open source compliance review, which relates to the end product, the software component deliverable, and who will be receiving it. Different parties receiving the deliverable will have different rights and requirements according to the open source licenses. And this can be broken broadly into two categories: people inside your legal entity and people outside the legal entity. Open source licenses use copyright as their fundamental building block, and if you're giving the final software component to people inside your legal entity, then you're not regarded as distributing the software. You're effectively giving it to yourself. And this means that the distribution requirements applied by the open source license will not be activated. If you're giving the final software component to people outside your legal entity, including other group companies with a different legal entity, you're distributing the software externally, and this means that the distribution requirements applied by the open source license will be activated. And the format of distribution may also be impacted by the open source licenses. It's important to consider questions such as: who is the software component distributed to? How is the software component distributed? Is source code included or offered? Have you documented the offer? Have you archived the software for future reference? These concepts discussed will be important while deriving the applicable license obligations for the open source components used, and it helps us to understand how an open source license allows us to use respective component and be bundled within our proprietary project.